Welcome back. Well, the Senate approving a temporary government funding bill to avert a weekend shutdown. Lawmakers now have until December 23rd to craft a full-year omnibus bill. The Senate also passed the $858 billion National Defense Authorization Act. The NDAA passed yesterday, increasing the fiscal year 2023 budget 10% compared to 2022. Joining me right now to look at all of that is the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget President, Maya MacGuineas. Maya, it's great to see you. Thanks very much. And you have been saying lawmakers need to commit to no more spending until year end at least. What are your thoughts on this most recent activity with the Senate passing it yesterday?
Well, my first thought is let's take a step back and recall that they never even passed a budget for this year. And 3.5 months late, they have passed something to fund the government for 1 week. So it's a pretty obvious conclusion, which is the way we budget in this country is utterly broken. And we have to figure out how to make sure that we actually lay out strategic plans for the nation, which are funded. So the basic principles of budgeting is something we really are going to need to return to. It becomes more urgent given all the pressing threats and needs that there are and the fact that we are not funding them, we are borrowing. Specifically, I think it is really troubling, and we should all be disturbed by the fact that no policymaker is actually willing to commit to not borrowing anymore for this year or next year at a time when the debt is at near record levels and every new dollar of borrowing pushes inflation up, not down. We should be really working to fight inflation. The way you do that, in addition to monetary policy, is make sure that you're not flooding the economy with additional funds. So it may be that they don't borrow a lot for this because they can't come up with any compromises to fund the remaining parts of the budget. But it's still a risk that there's a big compromise where it says, they say sort of, I'll borrow for my priority, you borrow for your priority, we'll stick all of this borrowing to the future and just throw a bunch of things in whatever the end of the year package ends up being. So I'm really hoping we can avoid that.
Well, I mean, I don't know that you're actually seeing the kind of urgency that one would expect when considering $31 trillion in debt. The president is taking a victory lap now on inflation. The consumer price index did come in lower than expected this week, but it still shows a rise of 7.1% year over year. And you're talking about food prices that are actually higher than they were the month earlier. A new Fox News poll shows 74% of voters say inflation has caused them financial hardship over the last 6 months. 26% of them surveyed say that it hasn't, Maya. Do they not equate the debt and the spending with overall economic factors and financial hardship?
Yeah, there's been an incredible ability to kind of separate the facts from how we got into this inflationary spiral from what we're doing right now to deal with it. And so it is good news that inflation isn't growing as quickly as it was before. Let's hope that it's starting to stabilize, but it's obviously much too high and still creating a lot of hardship. Much of this inflation started because there was additional spending after we had done important COVID bills. There was more money that was flooded into the economy under the name of COVID spending, but really was excessive, not well targeted, and it caused the beginning of inflation, which then, of course, was exacerbated from the situation in Ukraine and supply chain problems. So there are a lot of factors that went into this, but nobody should separate the fact from the fact that we borrowed too much money, and that pushed inflation up. Now the problem is how you deal with it, and it's really going to fall on the shoulders of the Fed. The Fed is not going to be satisfied with the inflationary numbers that we're at, right? They want to get inflation down to 2%. That is going to take significantly higher interest rates than we have. That is going to slow the economy. So there's going to be hardship both from inflation and from the fact that we're going to have higher rates, which could put us in a recession. This is a very, very tricky job the Fed has right now. The least that our politicians could do is restrain themselves from making the situation worse. And every time they borrow, instead of paying for their policies, they are making the inflation and the debt situation worse.
Right, because as we see interest rates going higher, the cost of carrying that debt becomes that much more expensive. And yet, Maya, the president is falsely claiming that his policies have actually lowered the national debt. Watch what he said this week. Look.
We've done all of this while lowering the federal deficit in the 2 years we've been in office, $1.7 trillion. Let me say that again. $1.7 trillion we've lowered the federal debt. No administration has ever cut the deficit that much.
So what is he saying? The national debt was $27.7 trillion in January 2021 when he took office. Now that debt is $31.4 trillion. During his first 23 months in office, the debt grew by nearly $3.7 trillion. That was misleading.
Yeah, Maria, I have to say that this repeated claim from the administration is one of the most frustrating things I have heard because it is completely misleading. What happened is that our annual deficit came down, of course, because so much of the money that we borrowed for COVID wasn't repeated. Those were temporary monies that we borrowed, and the deficit ballooned under COVID, was starting to come down on its own. When you look, however, at the policies that the administration has put in place, they have actually borrowed almost $5 trillion in new borrowing since taking office. This is close to a record in such a short amount of time. It is, as you've said, the debt has gone up. Much of that was because borrowing was already in place. And now what they've done is continue to pass bill after bill that has added to that borrowing and means the debt will continue to go up in the future. So they know that that is not an accurate way to describe what's happened, that taking credit for the fiscal situation is completely, it's like taking credit for the sun coming up in the morning, right? This was something that was going to happen, but the policies that they passed made the situation much worse than it would have been otherwise. And this administration has signed into law really an exorbitant amount of new borrowing, especially once the economy is recovered, and all that new borrowing is continuing to make economic conditions more challenging. So I really take issue with that claim. They repeated it many times, clearly wanting to brand themselves as fiscally responsible, but it's not accurate.
So, Maya, you've talked about the borrowing at $5 trillion, and the Republicans say the spending has been $10 trillion. I mean, it's hard to, get your head around these numbers. They are so mind-boggling. But Maya, are you saying that do you agree they spent $10 trillion but only had to borrow half of that? Is that the way you see it?
The numbers are really confusing because in budget world, we often talk about things over 10-year periods. So we have a $5 trillion budget. That's how much we spend per year. But when you look at the new things they're putting into place, you look at it over a longer term period. So I don't think anybody's being misleading there. I think the numbers have actually lost meaning because billions have turned into trillions. This really happened during COVID because we had to borrow so much. And now that we're talking about trillions, nobody could really wrap their arm around billions in the first place. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's so hard for people to care about this issue. The numbers are just too big to have any realistic assumption of what that really means to one's daily life. But it makes the economy worse, and it really jeopardizes both our economic and our national security in the longer terms to have borrowed that much and be that indebted.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it, Maya. Great to talk with you as always. Thanks so much. If we don't see you beforehand, have a Merry Christmas, Maya.